Hello, Nadia. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Yeah, this is Dr. Tanveer. I hope you can see this window. All of us are sitting here and we are connected with nearly 31 districts in
Wow.
Pakistan.
I can't see you.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So let me start this webinar. This webinar is on globalization and the women. We'll start this webinar with the recitation of Holy Quran. Any volunteer can recite holy verses.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد صدق الله العظيم.
We allow the other religious persons, if anyone is attending, can make his own prayer as well. Anywhere. So if there is no volunteer, then we'll start the webinar. So over to you, Nadia. Nadia is a consultant working for Hands International Nepal. Nadia has extensive experience of working around the world, especially in UN agencies and the out of UN. Nadia has been working, as far as I know, in not only she is based and national of Canada. She has done her education from Canada, and then she has done several assignments. The latest which I know is Sri Lanka, Thailand, Bangkok, and perhaps of Sri Lanka. And Nadia will tell herself in detail about her brief CV, curriculum vitae, and then she will start the webinar on globalization and the women issue. Nadia, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the presentation as well. One moment. Can everybody see?
Nadia, it is uploading. Wait a second. Yeah, it's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. So today's webinar will be on Has Globalization Failed Women? I'll do a little bit of an introduction to myself as well. Dr. Tanveer, thanks so much for introducing me. My work has actually previously been in Thailand, focusing on Asia Pacific, and as well in Botswana in Africa. I'm really happy to be here today to talk about my research and to discuss the ways in which we can understand gender and development better and how they intersect. Thank you so much to all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and listen. I really appreciate it.
Nadia, the only guiding tip from my side is just speak slowly.
Slowly. Okay, yes. Please tell me if I'm going too fast. So this is our schedule for today. I'll tell you a little bit about me. We can talk about what is globalization. We'll see a short video on development justice. We'll talk about gender analysis, take a look at 3 case studies, and then we'll have any time for questions and comments. After each case study, if you would like to ask a question, we can stop and have questions about specific case studies. Ever since I started working in gender and development, I have had people ask me, well, aren't some of these issues just human issues? Are you sure they're gender related? This type of question tells me that while many people understand the necessity of studying gender, they have yet to explore how pervasive gender issues actually are. We have to ask ourselves why. Why do these issues continue happening? What systemic issue is at play here that we must question and undo our own thinking about? In today's lecture, we will be looking at economic issues which are seemingly gender neutral, issues that people wouldn't necessarily think involve women. And then we will learn how to analyze them for an accurate impression of how they impact women. So as I said again, feel free to send in questions and I can answer them after each case study. Who am I? This might be a recap for some of you who have read the presentation flyer, but I am sure there are also many of you thinking, who is this woman who looks young enough to be my niece, and why is she talking to me about gender? My name is Nadia, and I recently began working for HANDS in Nepal 2 months ago. Since completing my studies, I worked for the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development in Thailand, and I also worked on women's agricultural development in Maun, Botswana. My areas of interest are looking at how globalization and the free market impacts women, as well as the environment. So what is globalization? Globalization is the open market between countries, essentially. The idea with this presentation is to analyze why women have fallen through the gaps. While major gains have been made in the last 20 years in the fields of development, improvements in the social, political, and economic standing of women have not necessarily improved at the same pace. Even though globalization is intended to allow all people to access the same goods and services, women are somehow left out of this opportunity. We often assess improvements through data, but we forget to analyze the greater social context. For example, we know that women outnumber men at universities, and that employed women often have higher degrees than men, but only 44% of the professional workforce is women. So why is there a gap between a perceived increase of women's education, but then still a lack of employment amongst women? How can we analyze them and correct them? HANDS is part of a movement that has made great strides in development, especially in the fields of health and education. This growth, coupled with economic growth, is supposed to lift countries out of poverty. So if health conditions are getting better, education levels are rising, and countries develop the infrastructure and industries to better the economy, why are countries not being lifted out of poverty? What is stopping countries? Although the economic growth has marked improvements, especially in health and education, the gap between men and women remains stagnant, or in some cases have even widened. While women begin to enter the workforce, their responsibility for the home and childcare remains just as overwhelming and demanding as before, and has not been evenly distributed among spouses. In this sense, women work a double day, as a child rearer as well as a worker. We must understand that equality between genders is not a goal of development, but instead is a condition of it. This is a video my work created. We're just going to watch. This was my previous position. We created this video, and I think it might be useful.
In the past 40 years, one economic model has dominated the global economy, a model that focuses on growth of production, growth of consumption, and growth of profits. To create this global growth economy, most governments agreed to create rules that benefit multinational corporations, privatize public resources and public goods, and push down real wages. This profit-focused global economy has caused two global crises: a crisis of deepening inequalities between people and a global environmental crisis. Together, these crises threaten the future of civilization and our planet. Inequalities between the rich and poor have grown in almost all countries. In fact, NASA-funded research found that inequalities are so high that they have become a threat to the very existence of civilization. But inequalities between countries have grown even larger. The bottom half of the world's 7 billion people collectively own the same as the richest 85 people in the world. Think about that. The richest 85 people own the same as 3.5 billion people. And 80% of the world's population still live on less than $10 per day. Another way of looking at this is through the Walton family. They own the world's largest retail store, Walmart, and have a collective net worth of $150 billion. Their wealth is derived from the work of poor people. Women garment workers in places like Bangladesh work for poverty wages, forgo health and safety standards, and risk their lives to make cheap disposable clothes for companies like Walmart. In an entire year, a woman garment worker from Bangladesh will make less than Christy Walton makes in 1 single second. There's a limit to an environment's ability to restore itself, and when we exceed these tipping points, we reach irreversible environmental changes that threaten our very existence. 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been exceeded. If we continue to consume the way we have, the results will be disastrous. In Bangladesh, tides are rising 10 times faster than the global average, yet the country only produces 0.3% of the emissions driving climate change. By 2050, 50 million people from Bangladesh will have to flee the country. Where will they go? Will they go to the countries with the most historical responsibility for climate change? Or will they be forced to migrate across borders? Women comprise 70% of the world's poor. They consume the least, are paid the least, and own the least, yet they pay the highest price. They are 14 times more likely to die in disasters. This is not an accident. This is a product of choosing to cut government spending, of privatizing public services and assets, and of providing tax havens for foreign industries. It's a product of growing multinational companies, unlimited extraction of natural resources, and overconsumption. In reality, we have a system of governance that secures profits for billionaires, but not a global system to secure human rights, economic justice, environmental justice, and accountability to peoples. Governments have created a system of binding rules to ensure the flow of wealth from developing countries to the richest countries. Rich countries try to compensate for the huge and growing gap by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. So why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. This costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest every year. Who is developing who here? People around the world are demanding a new, fairer approach to development. They are demanding development justice. They are demanding development that aims to reduce inequalities of wealth, power, and resources between countries, between rich and poor, and between men and women. A truly transformative development agenda requires a range of goals and targets. A new development agenda requires money. We can take these funds from global taxes on harmful practices and from those who exploit the world's resources, particularly transnational corporations. We can tax financial speculation globally. A financial transaction tax of 0.05% could raise $650 billion a year for governments to tackle poverty and address climate change. Less than 1% of the total value of extractive industries globally is enough to cover the annual cost of universal access to clean renewable energy. Just 5% of high net worth individuals' wealth is enough to cover the annual cost of universal social protection and universal social services. Just 1% of the global military budget would ensure universal public education. A more just and sustainable world is possible only if we demand it. Join us and demand development justice.
I hope that's a video that you all found informative and hopefully learned something from. It is available publicly if you would like to use it. The part about the video that I would like to draw your attention to is the part where she talks about how global wealth is leaving poorer countries, especially through private corporate companies, and yet women make up 70% of the global poor. This means that when wealth leaves these countries, women suffer the highest impacts. As the video said, women consume the least, are paid the least, and own the least. So when we talk about kind of privatization of public resources and kind of the private sector's interference in development, it's important to keep in mind that whatever negative effects these partnerships might have, that women will always bear the brunt of the difficulties because they are consuming the least, owning the least, and are being paid the least.
Okay, Nadia, give me 1 minute.
Sure.
Just to explain what you have shown by now, and then you can move. And this is in Urdu, so maybe you may not be able to get it. अच्छा जी, ग्लोबलाइजेशन तो सुना है ना सबने, है ना? तो ग्लोबलाइजेशन में बात हो रही है. क्या है ग्लोबलाइजेशन? यानी ये ज़ाहिर है कि जो फाइनेंशियल इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं वर्ल्ड के, उनको उन्होंने ये असाइनमेंट सारी दुनिया को दिया. वर्ल्ड के फाइनेंशियल इंस्टीट्यूशन दो समझाते हैं, एक वर्ल्ड बैंक, एक IMF. उन्होंने कहा कि सारी दुनिया को बाउंड किया कि अंडर सर्टेन एग्रीमेंट आप ये ट्रेड जो है एग्रीमेंट ओपन कर दें अपनी ट्रेड्स को बाहर की ट्रेड से. तो बाहर वाले जाके, क्योंकि इस जमाने में यूरोप और अमेरिका जो है वो ज्यादा डेवलप है कॉर्पोरेट के लिहाज से, तो उन्होंने जाके गरीब मुल्कों में अपनी इन्वेस्टमेंट करनी शुरू की, यानी कि अपनी ट्रेड्स को, अपनी प्रोडक्ट को ले जाना शुरू किया. अब जो गरीब मुल्क की प्रोडक्ट जो है, एक तो वो चीपर थी और जाहिर है कि उसकी क्वालिटी इतनी नहीं थी जिस तरह, लेकिन इस वर्ल्ड ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट के जरिए जो अमीर मुल्कों की प्रोडक्ट को भेजा गया खास तौर पे गरीब मुल्कों में. अब जिस तरह हम अपने सोसाइटी में देखते हैं कि एक अमीर और गरीब की एक तबका पैदा हो जाता है, इस तरह दुनिया में भी, ग्लोबली भी एक अमीर और गरीब का तबका मौजूद है. जो रईस मुल्क है वो गरीब को उसी तरह एक्सप्लॉइट करते हैं जिस तरह हमारे मुल्क में कोई वडेरा एक्सप्लॉइट करता है. अब उस एक्सप्लॉइटेशन में गरीब गरीब तर होता है और अमीर अमीर तरह होता है. अब गरीब मुल्क में जो सबसे बड़ा जो वल्नरेबल ग्रुप है, हम सबको पता है, वो या तो वुमेन का है या चिल्ड्रन का है, जो ज्यादा मुतासिर होते हैं, या पुअर का होता है, जो और पुअरेस्ट हो जाता है जनरली. तो अब पावर्टी एलिवेशन कहते हैं कि अगर अमीर मुल्क, ये 1970s में एक फार्मूला आया था कि गरीब मुल्कों को अगर सिर्फ अपना ग्रॉस डोमेस्टिक प्रोडक्ट जो वो प्रोड्यूस करते हैं उसका 0.7% जो 20 अमीर मुल्क हैं वो गरीब मुल्कों को दे दें, कोई 120 के करीब गरीब मुल्कों को, तो उनका जो कर्जा है जो अमीर मुल्कों का वो उतर जाएगा. अब गरीब मुल्क, सारे गरीब मुल्कों का अमीर मुल्कों का कर्जा जो है 400, इन्होंने जो बताया $400 बिलियन है, 400 अरब डॉलर, और अमीर मुल्क गरीब मुल्कों से कमाते $600 अरब है. तो बात यह कि इस तरह से वो वडेरा है अमीर मुल्क, और वो वडेरा एक्सप्लॉइट करता है. वो न सिर्फ आपको फाइनेंशियली एक्सप्लॉइट भी करता है, बल्कि फिर वो आर्मी और उसके जरिए भी, जो कि हमारा मुकामी वडेरा होता है वो गुंडों के जरिए एक्सप्लॉइट कर रहा है, ये बड़ा वडेरा जो है आर्मी के जरिए एक्सप्लॉइट कर रहा होता है. और गरीब गरीब तर हो रहा है और अमीर अमीर तर होता है. अभी ऑक्सफैम की एक नई स्टडी आई है जिसमें 64 दुनिया के जो रिचेस्ट लोग हैं, जो ज्यादातर अमेरिका और इंग्लैंड और यूरोप में बैठे हुए हैं, ज्यादातर उनमें से US बेस होते हैं, 64 से उनकी टोटल प्रॉपर्टी उतनी है जो दुनिया के 2.5 अरब लोगों की, यानी 50% पॉपुलेशन की प्रॉपर्टी है. वो बराबर है 64 लोगों के बराबर. तो इतना मिसमैच है, इतना डिस्पैरिटी है, तो उसमें जाहिर है कि वुमेन ज्यादा एक्सप्लॉइट हो रही है. इन्होंने बार बार एग्जाम्पल दी बांग्लादेश की एग्जाम्पल एक टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री की बड़ी मशहूर है. बांग्लादेश की टेक्सटाइल इंडस्ट्री बहुत बड़ी है, बड़ी बूम किया उसने, और 70% वहां वर्कर जो है वुमेन है, और वो 100% वो इंडस्ट्री जो है वो बाहर की प्रोडक्ट बनाती है, यानी जैसे हम लिवाइस की जीन्स जिस तरह कहते हैं, इस तरह के कपड़े बनाती है, ब्रांडेड कपड़े बनाती है, और ब्रांडेड ज़ाहिर है अमेरिका के होते हैं. और लेकिन वहां पे वो ना उनकी प्रोटेक्शन का कोई काम है, ना उनकी जेंडर प्रोटेक्शन की कोई वो इंश्योर कर रही है, ना उनकी लाइफ इंश्योरेंस को इंश्योर कर रही है, ना उनका हेल्थ, ना एजुकेशन. तो वो एक्सप्लॉइट कर रही है थ्रू बांग्लादेश गवर्नमेंट और थ्रू बांग्लादेश प्राइवेट सेक्टर. तो ये उन्होंने बात की कि किस तरह जेंडर को, किस तरह वुमेन को गरीब मुल्कों में एक्सप्लॉइट किया जाता है थ्रू ग्लोबलाइजेशन. तो इसलिए वो ज्यादा और वल्नरेबल होती जा रही है, जो कि चीप लेबर भी होते हैं. Okay, Nadia, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much.
Actually, Nadia, I am Dr. Aslam from HANDS. My question is, you presented a general scenario of the globe where the poor is getting poorer and richer is getting more richer. So, but you did not specifically present any picture of the impact of this inequality and injustice on the women in your presentation. It was a general scenario is prevailing overall in the world, but your presentation lacking of a specific picture that the women is being humiliated by this overall policy of the different countries that are getting richer and richer.
Yes, this video was meant to be a general overview. I actually still have 3 case studies with a specific gender analysis to target exactly that question. So that was just one small part of the presentation. The presentation is still going to continue and take into account 3 different forms of public-private partnerships and specifically analyze how they impact women.
Okay, go ahead, and then we may ask you many more questions.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so before we take a look at case studies, we're going to use 5 questions in order to analyze them through a gendered lens. So these are just 5 general questions that we'll be looking at for each case study, and I think that they'll be helpful for you. So firstly, what are the roles of each player? This one seems pretty simple. What are the roles of women and men? But also looking at what other actors are at play here. Is the government here, the private sector, CSOs? Who else has a role in all of these case studies? Secondly, who has access to resources, benefits, and opportunities? And at the same time, who does not have access to resources, benefits, and opportunities? What is stopping people from having these access? Thirdly, who controls resources, benefits, and opportunities? Who's in control of how these are dealt out? Often, this can be found by looking at who owns the money, who's providing these resources, benefits, and opportunities, at whose mercy are the people have to answer to. Fourthly, who is making decisions and why? Who has the power to make these decisions? Why do they have it? Is it based on wealth, social status, age, caste, gender? And lastly, who is benefiting from the situation? And of course, who has the most to lose from the situation and who has the most to gain? Who is taking the greatest risk? So we'll be looking at 3 different scenarios, and in each scenario, we'll be asking and answering these 5 questions. So before we do the first case study, I'm just going to introduce what the concept is, since I'm not too sure if everyone is familiar with it. Our case study will look at Uber and UN Women and their short-term partnership. Before we start, I'll explain what is Uber. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, as I believe Uber is relatively new and currently only available in Lahore, though the company plans to expand in Pakistan soon. Uber is essentially a taxi program where clients can book rides through a mobile app. Their app allows a client to see which cars are nearby and how much they would charge to take them to their destination. Uber is so popular because it tends to be cheaper, more efficient than calling a taxi. Are there any questions on what exactly this does?
No, just tell us. I mean, we are not aware about this application or this tech.
Okay. So yes, basically it's just an app where you can call a taxi easier and faster, and these taxis are private citizens with private cars. I'm just explaining this as background, that way when we talk about the case study, you understand what it is. So Uber and UN Women. So an example in which private corporations and women's empowerment have failed in intersection is the partnership between Uber and UN Women. In March of 2015, Uber and UN Women announced a partnership to develop 1 million jobs for women specifically by 2020 in an effort to increase women's empowerment globally. 1 million new jobs for women, it's been hailed as a massive economic success for South Africa, where this project would take off. I'm not even going to touch on Uber's appalling safety record for women drivers and the amount of attacks and sexual assaults that women have faced using this application. But instead, I'm not even going to touch on that. But instead, let's talk about how women already make up a high percentage of those working in risky labor. Uber's 1 million jobs are contract jobs without healthcare and social benefits. It's possible that women supporting multiple children and multiple economic responsibilities could be working up to 60 hours a week and still have no benefits. They still might not make enough money to make ends meet. What if their child is sick? What if something goes wrong? There's no security. Specifically, the economic growth is due primarily to increase in available women's cheap and exploitable labor. While women's labor market participation has grown, the conditions and wages that the majority of women workers receive are still below subsistence. The failure to increase minimum wage has allowed the gap between minimum wage and average living wage to grow, and the gap between minimum wage and the GDP to also grow. The majority of women in developing nations work in employment that lacks basic security, benefits, and safe working conditions. So let's go back to our questions and ask, what is the role of each player? So in theory, women are supposed to be getting these jobs, and they have these contract positions without benefits. The UN is spending international funds gathered from around the globe on this project, and Uber is implementing the project and taking a cut of its profits. So who has access to resources, opportunity, and benefits? It could be argued that women have access to these opportunities, but these are contract jobs that do not come with benefits. So they do not have access to the benefits and the resources they need to fight for the benefits. The resources come from the UN and Uber, neither of which have seemed to consult the project's beneficiaries to learn more about the outcome of this project. So who makes the decisions in this case, and why? In this case, although UN Women is contributing funds, Uber is the most powerful player, as they are funding the program and implementing it. In essence, they have total control over the project, and through this partnership, can deem this project as a gender equality project, no matter what the circumstance. This is a powerful marketing tool at their disposal that they can use to enlarge their company and enlarge their company's status. So what motivates Uber? Why does Uber feel like they are the best implementing partner? Is it because they have a long history and deep understanding of gender inequality? Or is it because they have the money to back up their ideas and therefore can choose whichever programs are in their best interest? Women have the most to lose in this situation, not only through precarious work conditions, but also through insecure labor, which no matter how hard they work, will never come with benefits or any job security. In fact, the International Transport Federation wrote that Uber jobs would not only contribute to women's economic empowerment, but it represents exactly the type of structural inequality within the labor market that the women's movement have been fighting for decades. Here, I'll give you that quote. But with this human rights marketing plan for the increased revenue from expanding their business at the expense of women's unpaid fairly labor, Uber has the most to gain. Can we really trust them to act in the best interest of the people? This is a situation where a public and private partnership is coming together, and ultimately the benefits are going to be taken off women's lowly paid and undervalued labor. Sorry, so that's our first case study. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, what you are saying, is that this Uber model is a very rational model for women empowerment, or the impact of this model was reverse?
I'm saying that it was marketed as a tool for women's empowerment, but that it actually achieved none of those things because the type of empowerment it was offering was so poor and ultimately just a method of getting women's labor for very cheap, unreasonable,
Very interesting. Just let me narrate this story. It's
Absolutely.
very important to understand. अब देखें जी, हम समझते हैं कि हम औरतों के लिए काम कर रहे हैं, बड़े जेंडर के प्रोजेक्ट भी होते हैं, वुमेन एम्पावरमेंट का लफ्ज भी लिखा रहता है वहां पे, और ये समझ जो वुमेन एम्प्लॉयमेंट का मतलब जेंडर डेवलपमेंट सिर्फ नहीं है. इतनी बड़ी वर्कफोर्स इन्होंने एम्प्लॉय की, एक एजेंसी ने यूएन एजेंसी के साथ मिलके 1 मिलियन औरतों को एम्प्लॉय किया, और उसमें एम्पावरमेंट इसलिए नहीं थी कि वहां पे एक्सप्लॉयटेशन हो रही थी, वहां पे वायलेशन हो रही थी, वहां पे सेक्सुअल एब्यूज था वहां पे. तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा चैलेंज है कि, और ये समझना भी चाहिए हर एक को कि वुमेन वर्कफोर्स का मतलब सिर्फ मतलब इतना आसान नहीं है कि जी जेंडर डेवलपमेंट हो गई. नो, ठीक है. और जब भी हम कोई वुमेन रिलेटेड प्रोजेक्ट करें, हम हर प्रोजेक्ट में हम बोलते हैं कि जेंडर इज क्रॉस कटिंग, तो हमें ये मुसलसल एनालाइज करते रहना होगा, जिस तरह इन लोगों ने एनालाइज किया एट दी एंड कि वेयर इज वुमेन एम्पावरमेंट, कि वेयर इज वुमेन रैशनल वर्कफोर्स प्रैक्टिसेस, या उनकी प्रोटेक्शन का ख्याल रखा गया, सोशल प्रोटेक्शन का या नहीं. तो ये सवाल बार बार करने चाहिए और हर वक्त करते रहना चाहिए. हम अपने प्रोजेक्ट्स को भी उसी तरह एनालाइज करते रहें. ओके नादिया, थैंक यू.
Nadia, Sama here. Need to ask a single question. You have mentioned the empowerment continuously. Do you think UN and all this stuff research has been conducted? I don't know if this right or no, wrong. But for making an empowerment, you have to create a mindset. Usually, if you see the Western culture, it is quite different than an Eastern culture. And in Eastern culture, you face this women empowerment, inequality at a very large scale as compared to Western culture. In Europe, in Africa side, there is some rights, more rights the woman has as compared to if you see in South Asia and Asia Pacific side. So do you think before investing that much heavy amounts on the women development, you have to start from very grassroots level? You have to change the mindsets of the parents, of the people around the globe, so that they can build their mind. They know what is inequality, because now the mind.
Osama, we'll park this question till the end, and Nadia will respond this question at the end of the presentation, because it's a general comment. So any question related to clarity of the presentation up till now can be asked in between. Then the general question or debate can be started at the end of the presentation. Okay, Nadia, go ahead.
Thank you so much. What I'll actually do is I will introduce the second case study, give a bit of background about it. Perhaps Dr. Tanvir, you can explain it in Urdu, and then I can explain the kind of the analysis. That might be easier.
Okay.
So we're going to look at the privatization of water, specifically in Argentina, where you can see on the map. The privatization of public resources is an old debate on how we can make our systems more efficient, more accessible, and behind closed doors, more profitable. For example, Argentina privatized their public water access to a French multinational corporation in the 1990s. This decision gave the private company unprecedented access to national and local water supplies. Water scarcity became an issue for Argentina in the early 2000s, and the Argentinian government froze the price of water. The French corporation who hiked the price of water up during the crisis sued the Argentinian government for interfering with their profits. So essentially what's happening here is that because the Argentinian government allowed this corporation access to privatized water, the corporation now is able to say that their right to profit is more important than the citizens' right to water. In this sense, although privatization was supposed to help the people, it's now made life even more difficult because they're at the mercy of this corporation and how much they want to charge for water. In fact, the tribunal which handled this case ruled in favor of the corporation, citing that the right to water must be counterbalanced with the corporation's right to profit. Dr. Tanvir, would you like to?
Oh yeah, very important. एक तो हमने टर्मिनोलॉजी सुनी ग्लोबलाइजेशन की. अब जब भी ग्लोबलाइजेशन का वर्ड हो उसको जरूर पढ़ना. ये ग्लोबल पॉलिसीज से मुतालिक सारा डिस्कशन है आज का. दूसरी एक टर्म है प्राइवेटाइजेशन. ये भी ग्लोबलाइजेशन का एक्सटेंडेड आर्म है, यानी ग्लोबलाइजेशन के एजेंडे में जिसको के में शामिल है. اور ہمیں یہ میسیجز دیے جاتے ہیں کہ ہر چیز جو پرائیویٹائز ہو جائے, جیسے ہم بڑے خوش ہوتے ہیں کہ کراچی الیکٹرک جو ہے پرائیویٹائز ہو گئی, یا جی پبلک پرائیویٹ پارٹنرشپ, یہ بھی ایک پرائیویٹائزیشن کا ایک میتھڈ ہے جس میں ہم بھی شامل ہیں. تو ایشو یہ ہے کہ کچھ سروسز جو سوشل سیکٹر سروسز ہیں دنیا میں ہر جگہ, اور رئیس ملکوں کی بات کر رہے ہیں, وہاں پہ گورنمنٹ لائبل ہے دینے کو ایز اے کانسٹیٹیوشن, ایز اے لا, ایز اے سٹیزن, ان کو ایز اے گورنمنٹ جو ہے لائبل ہوتی ہے. جیسے پانی دینا ہے, اسکول ہیلتھ کی سروسز دینا, ایون انگلینڈ جیسے رئیس ملک میں اس ایجوکیشن اور ہیلتھ ٹوٹلی فری ہے آپ کے, اور گورنمنٹ باؤنڈ ہے کہ آپ کے بچوں کو اور آپ کو یہ تعلیم اور صحت دے. لیکن ہمارے ملک میں غریب, آج کل جو غریب جو ہے وہ پیسے دیتا ہے جب جا کے سروس ملتی ہے. ایون گورنمنٹ ہاسپٹل میں بھی اگر وہ جا رہے ہیں نا تو اپنی جیب سے اس سے زیادہ وہ خرچ کرتا ہے, کیونکہ اس کو ٹرانسپورٹ کاسٹ لگتی ہے, کیونکہ قریب کوئی بی ایچ یو نہیں ہے, آر ایس سی نہیں ہے, پھر اس کو وہاں جا کے جی یہ دوائی باہر سے لے آؤ, یہ ایکس رے باہر سے کرا دو, یہ الٹرا ساؤنڈ باہر سے کرا دو. یہ تو پھر یہ کانسیپٹ لوگ انٹروڈیوس کراتے ہیں, نہیں جی پرائیویٹ کر دیں. جیسے کراچی الیکٹرک ہے, ہم بہت خوش ہوتے ہیں کہ جی کراچی الیکٹرک نے بڑا کمال کر دیا, لیکن وہ ہم سے کتنے زیادہ چارجز لے رہی ہے. ہم جیسے لوگ تو پھر بھی پے کر سکتے ہیں, تو چلو ٹھیک ہے, لیکن غریب کہاں سے پے کرے؟ غریب اپنے اسکول کی بچوں کی فیس دے, غریب اپنے ہیلتھ کی, اپنے بچوں کی ڈاکٹر کی فیسیں دے, اور پھر غریب جو ہے وہ اتنی ہائی کاسٹ ایک کمپنی جو ہے جو کہ کارپوریٹ ہے, جس کا کام مقصد, جن کے کارپوریٹ کے بارے میں ایک لفظ بہت آسان بولا جاتا ہے کہ پروفٹ بیفور ہیومن, کہ وہ پہلے منافع دیکھیں, انسانیت بات کی چیز ہے. انسانیت کوئی چیز نہیں ہوتی کارپوریٹ کے نزدیک. پیسہ دیں, آپ خریدیں چیزیں, کموڈیٹی خریدیں. تو غریب کے لیے زندگی جینے نے, جو اس میں پالیسی یہ ہے کہ آپ ڈائریکٹ ٹیکس دیں اور ٹیکس دے کے ریلیف دیں غریبوں کو. اب یہ یہاں پہ جو کیس اسٹڈی ہے وہ نائجیریا کی, وہ واٹر کی ہے, پانی. الحمدللہ ابھی تک پاکستان میں ہم نے پانی کو پرائیویٹائز نہیں کیا ہے, بہت لوگوں نے روکا ہوا ہے, پریشر ہے. انڈیا میں ہو چکا ہے, اور یہ ارجنٹینا کی ایگزامپل ہے. فرینچ کمپنی کو جی پانی مل نہیں رہا, ارے پانی پہنچانا تو گورنمنٹ کا کام ہے نا, گھر تک کسی بھی غریب یا امیر کے. ٹھیک ہے, امیر سے تھوڑا زیادہ پیسہ لے لے, غریب کو فری کرے, لیکن جی وہ ہم تو نہیں کر سکتے, گورنمنٹ کہتی ہے ہم تو نہیں کر سکتے, اس لیے پرائیویٹ کمپنی کو دے دو. اور فرانس کی پرائیویٹ کمپنی کو پانی کا ٹھیکہ دے دیا انہوں نے کہ جی پانی اب آپ پہنچائیں. وہ کیسے, وہ فری میں تو نہیں پہنچائے گی, پروفٹ بیفور ہیومن. تو پروفٹ کما کے اب غریب تو بیچارہ مر گیا. اور کیونکہ ہیلتھ کی بیسک ریکوائرمنٹ یہ ہے, پلینٹی آف واٹر اینڈ سیف واٹر از بیسک ریکوائرمنٹ فار دی ہیلتھ اینڈ ہائیجین. اب وہ غریب مر گیا بیچارہ, وہ ڈیزیز میں ڈاکٹر کو بھی پے کر رہا ہے, اس میں بیماریوں میں بچے اس کے ریٹارڈیڈ ہو رہے ہیں, میل نیوٹریشن اس کے بچوں کو ہو رہا ہے. تو انہوں نے بعد میں پروف کیا, وہاں کی جو فیڈریشن جو کمیونٹی آرگنائزیشن تھی اور جو ایکٹیوسٹ تھے, کہ نہیں, دس از رانگ وے, وی ول گو اگینسٹ اٹ. تو یہ ایک اور کیس اسٹڈی ہے جو نائجیریا کی تھی, جو پرائیویٹائزیشن سیکٹر کتنا خطرناک بھی ہو سکتا ہے کسی بھی ایریا میں, اگر جہاں پہ خاص طور پہ غریب ملکوں میں جہاں پہ ریگولیٹری میکانزم اسٹرانگ نہیں ہوتے, گورنمنٹ اتنی اسٹرانگ نہیں ہے, وہاں پہ پرائیویٹائزیشن اور خطرناک ہے. جی نادیہ, اوکے گو ایڈ نادیہ.
Thank you so much. It sounds like Dr. Tanvir briefed you a little bit more about the role of water and women and nutrition and wash and all the other things that hands.
One more comment, Nadia. اب یہ واٹر از سو امپورٹنٹ, واٹر اور دونوں سینیٹیشن ہمارے یہاں وومن کے کیس میں جینڈر ریلیٹڈ ایشو ہے. یہ جینڈر ریلیٹڈ ایشو کیسے کہ جی عورت پانی نہیں ہوتی تو عورت کو جانا پڑتا ہے. سیکچوئل وائلیشن سیویئر ہے یہاں پہ, جب عورت سینیٹیشن کے لیے, ٹوائلٹ کے لیے یا پانی لینے کے لیے گھر سے باہر جا رہی ہے. کوئی یہاں پہ ہم ہائٹ کرتے ہیں, ہم چھپاتے ہیں ان چیزوں کو, ہم بات نہیں کرتے. گرلز ڈراپ آؤٹ ریٹ ان ایجوکیشن فیسلٹی کیوں سب سے ہائی ہے؟ ٹوائلٹ فیسلٹی نہیں ہے, کیونکہ لڑکیوں کی ریکوائرمنٹ ٹوائلٹ کی زیادہ ہے لڑکوں کے مقابلے میں. ٹوائلٹ فیسلٹی, اس لیے گرلز ڈراپ آؤٹ ریٹ ہائیسٹ ہے پاکستان میں, اور کلاس 5 تک پہنچنے تک نیئرلی 70-80% گرلز ڈراپ آؤٹ ہو جاتی. سو اس لیے یہ سروسز زیادہ امپورٹنٹ ہے, پرائیویٹائزیشن اس کو اور زیادہ ایکسپلائٹ کرتا ہے. اوکے نادیہ.
So as Dr. Tanvir mentioned, if girls' dropout rates are so high when there's no water available, how can we be, or how dangerous is it for us to put the rights of water to a corporation whose main intention is to make profit? if we don't pay them the amount of money they want, we could lose the amount of girls' education. That's an important link that I think. Thank you so much, Dr. Tanvir, for making it. So now when we talk about the roles of each player in this, particular with the privatization of water, we can talk about how the government's best interest is supposed to be for the people. And of course, usually by signing these agreements, they intend to act in the best interest of the people. They want the right to water to be easier, more efficient. The corporation, their role is to make a small, but ultimately unregulated, amount of profit by working in a sector aimed at the public greater good. They want to provide the public with a service, and in exchange, they'll take a small profit. And even though that profit starts out small, it's not necessarily regulated. It can grow to a large amount. And then in the home, men are supposed to bring home money to help pay for the water, and they're supposed to help provide for the families through traditional gender roles. And women are in charge of the water. This is the part where it gets really important. The responsibility and burden of ensuring a family's access to water has always been disproportionately fallen onto women. Traditional gender roles have women across the globe picking up liters of water on their way home from work, if they are lucky. If not, they are walking miles to get water with their children and boiling and treating the water to ensure it can be drunk and used. So who has access to the resources and benefits here? Who controls them? When privatization turns sour, like it did for Argentina in the form of enormous price hikes, water cutoffs, deteriorating water quality, as well as health and sanitation standards, women are disproportionately affected. The distance traveled to access safe water grows larger, which increases the pressure on women's overburdened schedules. Low-income women who face time constraints, often by juggling multiple economic responsibilities, are forced to accept lower quality water. Water-related illnesses can drain a household budget as funds are diverted towards medical bills or the rising cost of water. As Dr. Tanvir mentioned, Hans knows all too well that the lack of water translates to higher dropout rates in schools amongst girls as they stay home to help collect water, or they avoid school due to a lack of wash facilities. In this sense, the relationship between women and water is so deeply interconnected and is now in the hands of a corporation whose primarily target is to try and increase their profit. Are there any questions about that case study?
Any question for clarity? No, I think it's good.
Okay, we will go to our last case study. Microfinance. So microfinance was initially hailed as a solution to end poverty, specifically women's poverty. Microfinance is intended to be a short-term, small loan to a person in a developing country, often less than $100 US. The capital is provided by a person in a developed country and brokered through a microfinance institution, which is essentially a bank facilitating small loans from individual to individual. The borrower is supposed to use the money in entrepreneurship, ideally to lift themselves out of poverty. So essentially, a person in a developing country can access a small, short-term loan and ideally use it in an activity that will get them more money, such as opening a shop or perhaps learning a new service. Therefore, through this new service, they can make an income and pay back this loan in small amounts. The loan is easy to get with no background check, and it is estimated that 600 million Microcredit clients have over 100 billion outstanding loans. Dr. Tanvir, did you want to explain the background?
Yeah, अब ये तो माइक्रो फाइनेंस के ऊपर अब नया एक इशू है. माइक्रो फाइनेंस इज वेरी डिबेटेबल टॉपिक. बहुत सारे लोग इसके स्कूल ऑफ अगेंस्ट हैं, बहुत सारे फेवर में. लेकिन जाहिर है कि हमें वी आर रनिंग ऑल द टू. एक तो इंटरेस्ट फ्री है, दूसरा जो है इंटरेस्ट बेस है. अब हमें दोनों में ये देखना है कि क्या हम जेंडर को फोकस कर पा रहे हैं. अभी भी जाहिर है, जैसे हम सबको पता है कि इन दोनों प्रोजेक्ट्स में जो है औरतों को नहीं दे पा रहे हैं हम, कोई भी रीजन हो. लेकिन इसका मतलब है कि जेंडर डिस्क्रिमिनेशन तो कर रहे हैं, नंबर वन. नंबर टू, जब मिलता है अगर औरत को, तो वो कहाँ तक उसको वो अपना कंट्रोल उसके ऊपर रखती है, उस फाइनेंसिस के ऊपर या उस इंटरप्राइज के ऊपर. तो ये हमें जेंडर एनालिसिस हर वक्त, आज के इस वेबिनार का मकसद ये है कि जेंडर कोई थ्योरी नहीं है, जेंडर प्रैक्टिसेस का नाम है, और हर वक्त हमें एनालाइज करते रहना चाहिए, एनालिसिस करते रहना चाहिए अपनी हर एक्शन में, हर प्रोजेक्ट में, हर एक्टिविटी में, हर गोल्स को अचीव करने में, कि कहीं पे जेंडर डिस्क्रिमिनेट नहीं हो रही, कहीं पे जेंडर एक्सप्लॉइट नहीं हो रही। यस नादिया।
Perfect, thank you. So the reason I want to bring up microfinance and microcredit is because getting a loan is so easy that often these loans aren't really used in the intended way. They're supposed to be used to lift yourself out of poverty with an entrepreneurial reason. But the bank knows that borrowers don't have a steady plan to repay their loans, and then they benefit off of the high interest rates that they can charge. Interest rates from a microcredit institution often rival those of a small bank loan. So in this sense, microcredit often falls prey to three misleading ideas. One, overhype. Microcredit assumes that poor people are poor not because they are untrained or illiterate, but instead that they are poor because they cannot benefit off their labor like an entrepreneur. In this sense, microcredit offers short-term cash instead of an investment in literacy or training. Secondly, imprudent lending. Microfinance often ends up making poverty worse. Most microcredit loans are used to fund basic consumption, to help people buy the necessities they need to get by. In South Africa, basic consumption accounts for 94% of all microfinance loans. Without a way to pay the loan back, the borrowers will take out new loans to pay back the old loan and then wrap themselves in a layer of debt. This is a gender-specific issue, as women who have the majority of the burden of responsibility for taking care of the family will often take out loans for consumption reasons, such as to provide rent, food, or education for their children. That's the most common use of these loans. As those activities are non-income generating, for example, their children's education will not necessarily get them money, or providing food for their family will not necessarily get them money, these loans cannot be repaid back, and women begin cycling into debt. The third way that that microfinance is misleading is because of the profit-focused nature of the institution. Despite good intentions to help the poor, microcredit is still a profit-based solution. This means that when the poor accept money, they are at the mercy of the lender who is looking to make a profit. The Atlantic conducted a study that showed that so many women who engage in these microfinance loans, who wind up wrapping themselves in layers of debt, wind up committing suicide. There's an extremely high rate of female suicide who are microcredit borrowers, because they cannot get themselves out of debt. The interest rates are simply too high, and they've borrowed money for things to provide for their family. Apparently, we need expensive research to come to the conclusion that the poor are poor because they don't have enough money. So let's talk about the roles of each player. Who controls the resources, benefits, and opportunities? The control is in the hands of the lender, who has a duty to ensure that the borrower is able to pay the loan back. In this sense, this check is supposed to be done by the broker, the microfinance institution. But in reality, because there is no background check, there's no concrete plan for these people to pay back their loan. In a developed country, if you offer someone a loan at a large interest rate with no background check or solid method of repayment, you are dubbed as a loan shark. Because these loans amounts are so small in the eyes of developed countries, it is deemed acceptable. It's only a $30 or $50 loan, completely forgetting that small amounts of money in Western countries can be rent, food, and education in a developing country. So who has the most to lose from these situations? Women have the most to lose in this situation by entering into a precarious and risky deal in order to provide for their families. When the burden of the family falls onto the mother, the burden of providing at all costs also falls onto her. While men also have to deal with microfinance loans in the same way, because of their increased access to resources and opportunity, they're more likely to use microfinance loans for entrepreneurial reasons. though this is not always the case. Though the majority of times that women take out microfinance loans, it is solely to provide for the family without any way of repaying this debt. So just before we end and have more questions, what are the common links between these three case studies? The three common links I found was the investors' desire to make profit overran their desire to make change. So even though water was privatized in Argentina with the idea of providing for the Argentinian people, their desire to hike up the price of water and profit off the Argentinian people overran their desire to make change. This change came at the expense of economically disadvantaged people. In microfinance, the women who are economically disadvantaged in taking out their loans bear the greatest burden of debt repayment, including the interest loans cycling out of control. And lastly, the structural nature of patriarchy ensured that this burden falls most heavily onto women. So even though an investor's desire to make profit the burden will fall onto the people, as women make up 70% of the global poor, they own the least, consume the least, and are paid the least, the greatest burden of an investor's profit will fall onto them.
There is another common link in these case studies, and that is the government ability to cope up the situation and trying to get rid of the situation by handing over the project to the private sectors.
That is absolutely a difficulty, and I would hold the government accountable for that. Although I think in many of these cases, the countries are in poverty, and therefore the government sees this as a way to provide for its people, and winds up getting them into situations where they are at the mercy of the corporation. This is obviously a very dangerous situation, but I don't doubt that for many countries it starts off with the intention of wanting to provide for the people, however misled it is.
Let me interrupt for a minute only, just for the sake of this audience. अच्छा, हम माइक्रो फाइनेंस पे बात कर रहे हैं. माइक्रो फाइनेंस में नादिया कहती हैं कि तीन मसले होते हैं, तीन इश्यूज आते हैं, स्पेशली इन रेफरेंस टू जेंडर. एक तो माइक्रो फाइनेंस को उन्होंने बहुत ओवर हाइप किया हुआ है, बहुत ज्यादा इसकी शोहरत की हुई है कि गवर्नमेंट या दूसरे इदारों को, प्राइवेट इदारों को, और गवर्नमेंट खुद भी माइक्रो फाइनेंस स्कीम लॉन्च करती है. जैसे हमारे मुल्क में भी गवर्नमेंट ने अलाउ किया बहुत से इदारों को, और उनको एंडोमेंट फंड भी दिए. एनआरएसपी की एग्जांपल है, या ये जो हमारा खुशहाली बैंक है, ये भी गवर्नमेंट ने ही ज़ाहिर है कि एस्टेब्लिश किया था, वो प्राइवेट हो गया है. तो उसमें बजाय ये कि अब पुअर के साथ हमदर्दी इस तरह से करने के कि आप हेल्थ और एजुकेशन की सर्विसेज इंप्रूव करें, आप एक नई चीज लेके आ जाते हैं. जी हम तो माइक्रो फाइनेंस दे रहे हैं गरीबों को, ताकि वो गरीब. गुर्बत कभी सिर्फ माइक्रो फाइनेंस से खत्म नहीं होगी अगर हम उनको हेल्थ सर्विसेज नहीं देंगे, और हेल्थ फैसिलिटी यानी हेल्थ और एजुकेशन सर्विसेज, आइडियल है एजुकेशन सर्विसेज नहीं देंगे तो गुर्बत कभी नहीं खत्म हो जाएगी. ये साइकिल चलता रहेगा. तो वो उसमें फिर दूसरे ये कि उनके ऊपर कर्जा, जब माइक्रो फाइनेंस लेता है तो कर्जा में हो जाता है. उन्होंने बताया नादिया ने कि एक कर्जे को निभाने के लिए वो दूसरा कर्जा लेते हैं. तो हमारा भी एक्सपीरियंस है कि जहां 2-3 माइक्रो फाइनेंस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन काम करती है तो वो एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन से कर्जा लेते हैं, उसको दूसरी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन को पे कर रहे होते हैं, दूसरे से लेते हैं तीसरी. अब जेंडर इश्यू इसमें बहुत ज्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है. वो ये कि खवातीन जब कर्जा लेती हैं तो वो खवातीन ज्यादा कंसर्न होती हैं अपने बच्चों के और अपने आप की जो सेहत के, मेल के मुकाबले में. हमेशा ये हमारा एक्सपीरियंस है कि सारा ये कम्युनिटी में जब जाएं तो वो जो मर्द से पूछें कि बच्चे की सेहत कैसी है तो मर्द बोलेगा मुझे क्या पता, बीवी से जाके पूछो, मेरी बीवी से जाके पूछो. तो वो खर्च भी ज्यादा इसमें करती हैं, यानी इलाज में खर्च कर देती हैं, बच्चे की तालीम में खर्च कर देती हैं, और जो शादी वादी हो उसमें खर्च कर देती हैं, घर को लेपा पोती में खर्च कर देती हैं. अब ये डेब्ट बन जाता है, कर्जा बन जाता है. अब वो इससे इनकम तो नहीं हुई ना उस कर्जे से. कर्जे का तो शायद एक मकसद सिर्फ ये होना चाहिए कि उससे इनकम हो, तो ये इनकम नहीं हुई क्योंकि वो पहले ही गरीब हो. तो फिर वो एक कर्जा लेके दूसरा कर्जा दिलाएगी, दूसरा कर्जा लेके तीसरा. अब जब औरत या जो भी कमजोर ग्रुप हो, चाहे गरीब जो है जिसको हम कहते हैं, वो भी जब वो कर्जे में झिझकड़ा होता है तो उसको एक्सप्लॉइट करना ज्यादा आसान होता है. उसको एक्सप्लॉइट करना, हर किस्म की एक्सप्लॉइटेशन ज्यादा आसान होती है. तो ये है बहुत बड़ा जेंडर का इशू जो कि माइक्रो फाइनेंस के साथ है. ओके नादिया.
Thank you so much. All right, I did want to answer that question that came up earlier before we start, that I said I would answer at the end. In terms of, yes, we should be focusing on grassroots solutions, ideally solutions that don't involve corporate funding or corporate strings, which start at the grassroots, come from the people, and are able to target gender inequalities at a young age and change the way we think about these issues. Now, the issue is that thinking about these issues differently will only get us so far. That is a really important step, and that's the majority of what needs to be done. But the other problem is that the funds needed, the capital needed, in order to make these changes structurally are in the hands of corporations. So we have to be in a situation where we can say no to corporate money. And that's something that, due to a imbalance between the people and the profits, is a really difficult thing to do. There's many people in these worlds who are not able to say no to corporate funding. They require that funding. They live off that funding. So in that sense, while we still live off this funding and the wealth gap between poor people and rich people continue getting bigger, although it's important to change the mindset of people in developing countries, it is also important for people in developed countries to take responsibility for the types of issues they are creating, to realize that the amount of wealth that they have gives them unprecedented power in agenda setting and deciding which ideas are spoken about and which ones deserve to be heard, and that the capital they're putting behind it needs to be done responsibly. Corporate social responsibility is not enough of a responsibility. That's just an arm of a corporate sector saying we want to make some differences, but not at the expense of our profit. And while the developed world continues to prioritize profit over the people in developing countries, we will not be able to achieve gender equality. Gender equality is not a goal of development, but a precondition to it. They have to work hand in hand. Are there any other questions?
कोई सवाल करना चाह रहे हैं? So, let me explain what you said about the corporate social responsibility. CSR जिसको हम कहते हैं, पाकिस्तान में कॉर्पोरेट सोशल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी का एक लॉ है जिसके तहत 0.1% जो प्रोडक्ट जो सेल है किसी भी कंपनी की, उसको वहाँ की जो कम्युनिटी जो कि इफेक्टेड कम्युनिटी कहलाती है उसको बेनिफिट देना चाहिए. ये CSR भी एक ऐसी गिमिक है जो कॉर्पोरेट्स करती है कि वो उस 0.1% को, सिर्फ 0.1% ऑफ देयर नेट प्रॉफिट है जिसको देना चाहिए. नहीं, वो भी किस तरह से देती है उसकी मैं एग्जांपल दूं. हमने फ्लड में काम किया तो एंग्रो के साथ हमें एक कंपनी एंग्रो जो मिल्क बनाती है ऑल्पर्स और एंग्रो फूड इंडस्ट्री है बहुत बड़ी, वो दे हैव गिवन अस CSR फॉर द फ्लड रिलीफ फॉर नियरली सम 3 million और 4 million या 5 million. अब उन्होंने क्या कंडीशन की हमारे साथ, उन्होंने ये कंडीशन लगाई कि यू हैव टू परचेज द आर ब्रांडेड मिल्क, नंबर 1. हमारा ऑल्पर्स ही आपको खरीदना होगा, नंबर 1. नंबर 2, यू हैव टू परचेज आर ब्रांडेड मिल्क विथ आवर मार्केट प्राइस, यानी हमारे सेल्स डिस्ट्रीब्यूटर से खरीदना पड़ेगा. अब मजे की बात है, इनके जो बिजनेस होता है उनके टारगेट सेट होते हैं मार्केटिंग के, सेल्स के. कॉर्पोरेट की ये होती है मजबूरी, और उनके हर मैनेजर्स के टारगेट सेट्स होते हैं जो मार्केटिंग में होते हैं. तो टू अचीव दोस टारगेट ऑफ बिजनेस दे हैव गिवन यूज द CSR एंड देन CSR कम्स बैक टू देम एज अ पार्ट ऑफ प्रॉफिट. तो दिस इज द स्टोरी ऑफ द कॉर्पोरेट ऑफ CSR. वो घूम फिर के उनके पास जाते हैं. And a company like Levi's is spending, we are talking about, is contributing through their CSR amount of only 600,000 rupees for 6 months awareness raising session for their staff. 15 months awareness raising session, which is joke. इनके जो net profits है of billions हैं, और CSR ये 6 लाख निकालने में इनको इतना मसला होता है. तो और फिर उसका भी रैशनल यूज, एथिकल यूज नहीं है, वो भी एक बहुत बड़ी डिबेट है. यस, अच्छा जी, कोई और क्वेश्चन? एनी क्वेश्चन फ्रॉम नादिया ऑन जेंडर एंड ग्लोबलाइजेशन? ग्लोबलाइजेशन इज वेरी कॉम्प्लेक्स टॉपिक. जी मीर साहब, माइक में बोले प्लीज.
any other questions?
Yeah, one of our colleague, Mir, is asking the question.
Yes, Nadia, Mir is here from Pakistan, hence Pakistan. Yeah, I have the question that you have already discussed, because we are discussing about the globally. Because the global interests are the different, because they have the economically interest in the community. And here we are discussing about the also the role of gender. So how you think about how we can motivate to these economic interest persons or economic interest agencies to deliver or to make the strategies for gender equality or gender development?
There's a big misconception that in order, okay, well, I'm going to get into some background, but I will answer your question. As in the case of the Argentinian privatization of water case study, the Argentinian government signed a contract with a corporation agreeing to not interfere with their profits, which is why they were which is why the Argentinian government was sued for trying to freeze the price of water. There's a very misleading idea that if countries don't sign this type of agreement, then they won't be able to get foreign investment. That corporations won't come and invest in them if they don't sign that agreement. This isn't necessarily true. Brazil signs none of those agreements and yet has an abundance of foreign investment. Whereas Canada, who's an extremely developed country, signs those agreements and agrees to not interfere with profits, and as a result is one of the most sued developed countries ever. So I think that one of the biggest things is to acknowledge that it's still possible to get corporate funding without agreeing to those rules, because the poor countries still have these resources, these natural resources that corporations want. And it's possible to negotiate them in a way that is better for the developing country, if that is something they choose to do. And secondly, I think we're talking about this as though the burden of responsibility is on people in developing countries. And we need people in developed countries to notice these things and to take account of them and to take responsibility for them and to join the fight against this corporate profit. I think that's starting now as people in developed countries are starting to recognize the impact of globalization and the impact of these private-public partnerships on their own lives. I think that notice is coming from a point of view where they recognize how it's impacting them. And we need to extrapolate that understanding and understand how it's impacting other people in developing countries. I think that we need the global population to take note of this, specifically from developed countries, where they also have the resources, opportunities, and wealth to make a difference and to fight these ideas.
Yes, if there is no question, we would like to conclude today's webinar. Ji?
I have just a comment.
Yes.
Go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Because I think because this is the real and the large issue, the gender development is mostly. So we should mention the subjects, some topics in the subjects of the courses, because I think they need this kind of the awareness and this kind of the sensitization from the childhood to because mostly we discuss these issues when we become the mature. Then we discuss about the gender and other related issues. So I think we should pressure and we should develop to motivate the government and the education department, schools and the administrations of any educational agencies to add the subjects or courses in the children's education regarding the gender development issues.
Absolutely. And the 5 questions we talked about who benefits, what are the roles here, who has access, who has control of resources, those are questions that lead to a very high quality and high level skill of critical thinking. And that type of critical thinking is something we absolutely need to be teaching to children at a young age. That way, maybe in age appropriate forms. That way, when they are ready to process this type of material, they're able to look at it critically and not just accept what's being presented to them. When they see a brochure from Unilever or whatever major corporation they see, How are they going to respond to that? We need to give them the critical eye. That way they can take into account what they're seeing and analyze it and extrapolate information based on their own critical thinking skills. I know we need to wrap up. I've left my email up on the screen. You are more than welcome to email me with questions. I always do like to hear some hopefully constructive feedback as well. This is my first time presenting to you all, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And lastly, I'd like to take this moment to commend HANDS for their gender analysis. HANDS looked at health, nutrition, and education issues with a gender analysis, and this is why so many of our projects surround the needs of pregnant women, mothers, and young girls. One of the challenges I have for HANDS is to start looking at further analysis and analyze why these issues are happening and not just how can we mitigate their impacts. Our analysis right now can go further and look at the targeting of the root of the problem, as many of you have mentioned in your questions. How can we target the root of their problem in addition to mitigating the impacts of gender inequality? Thank you so much for listening to me. It's been a real pleasure to be able to present for you, and I hope this was informative. Thank you.
Nadia, one
Nadia?
more question.
Nadia, not question. I just want to appreciate your efforts for the conduction of webinar on globalization and its of women. Really, we agreed all these points which you have mentioned, but we believe that current scenario of globalization has improved gradually the lives of the women worldwide, and particularly the lives of the women who is living in the developing countries. And we also believe that there is a lot of work to do. We have to do in the all that sector that women remain disadvantaged in many areas of their lives. So we will do, inshallah, and we are doing all these efforts. And another lesson learned for me that we have to do gender analysis in each and every project and program. So inshallah we will continue this thing. So thank you so much, Nadia, again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. And to be clear, globalization has opened doors for many people, and it's helped a lot in certain amounts of economic growth. My presentation was to make clear that economic growth has not always benefited women in the same way, and that often there are gaps in our knowledge and understanding of how women are impacted by globalization, and that the need for this analysis is there, even though globalization might not all be bad, and there might be some good parts to it, and there might be some parts that we want to continue. We have to conduct this analysis and recognize how it's impacting women.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you. The lesson learned is we have to not only gain the knowledge of all the happening around globalization, but also communicate this knowledge to the community members, to CBOs, and to the policy maker as well at the same time, the champions of Pakistan, the politicians, the bureaucrats, because they even don't have the knowledge of globalization, and they, without this knowledge, we can be trapped under the corporate mafia. So we need to keep this knowledge update and then see all the projects and policies and interventions in the light of the globalization and the light of the gender and the other discrimination. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you very much. We'll close this webinar now. Okay, bye.